If you haven't figured it out yet, our talk today is about evolution. Carl Sagan once said that science is not only compatible with spirituality, it is a profound source of spirituality. As someone who used to do science for a living and now is a science teacher, I wholeheartedly agree. Darwin thought so too. Darwin wrote in the last paragraph of The Origin of the Species, the book that laid out evolutionary theory, quote, "There is a grandeur to this view of life, with its several powers having been originally breathed by the Creator into a few forms or into one, and that whilst this planet has gone on cycling according to the fixed laws of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful have been and are being evolved," unquote. The grandeur and the awe in Darwin's view was that God or a creator or the universe had kicked this process off, and out of such simple, elegant rules, all of this could spring. There are lots of things I love about UU, but one of them is there are so many science nerds like me out there in the audience, and I know you're out there, so don't try to deny it. I also love that our seventh UU principle is respect for the interdependent web of all existence. And the reason why I wanted to give this talk today is I believe evolutionary theory has a lot to say about not only how that interdependent web of existence came to be and how it operates, but maybe how we can play a responsible, life-affirming part in it. Let's go back to the 3 ingredients I mentioned in the Time for All Ages. You might not have heard if you were on Zoom, so I'll go over it again. The 3 ingredients are variation, selection by consequences, and heredity. And understanding them is really important to understanding evolution. Variation just means that we're all a little different. As I look out there, some of you are tall, some of us are short, some people have blue eyes and some brown. Some people probably have great vision, and others of us are very nearsighted. Selection by consequences, our second ingredient, means that some of these characteristics work better than others for doing different things. Our characteristics sometimes have consequences. For example, if we had a zombie apocalypse, my eyesight would have consequences. If I lost my glasses, I'd have to literally get this close to a zombie before I recognize they're a zombie. And you can imagine how that would work out for me. This is one of the reasons I really want to get LASIK. If we think about that, it's more likely that tall people with keen eyesight would survive. Heredity, our third ingredient. Heredity means that there's some way of passing these characteristics on to the next generation. So those of you who are tall and have good eyesight and have all of these lovely genes are more likely to survive long enough in a zombie apocalypse to have children and pass on your genes. So luckily, the zombie apocalypse hasn't happened, and most of us are privileged enough that we don't have to struggle to survive like the vast, vast majority of our ancestors did. The story of how that came to be has to do with altruism and how cooperation evolved, which could be its own talk. But for today, I'm going to just talk about variation, selection, and heredity. Since Darwin, and especially in the last 40 years, there have been a lot of scientists and philosophers who've said, well, wait a minute. There are lots of systems where those 3 ingredients of variation, selection, and heredity are operating. If it's really true that evolution happens whenever we have these 3 ingredients, then evolution must be at work in all kinds of different domains. Businesses kind of do that, right? There's a variety of businesses, some work better than others, and they bring those traits out into the future. Behavior and learning seem to have these ingredients as well. After all, we have different routines and behaviors. That's variation. Some of them are reinforced more than others. That's selection. And we either consciously or unconsciously do those behaviors that are selected again. That's heredity. Culture does this too. Over time, certain practices are selected and shared, and some aren't. And this in turn influences what practices we do in the future. But here we've got to be careful. When we get into talking about cultural evolution, we have to be really, really careful. We get into trouble when we think of evolution as a linear process that's ultimately leading somewhere or has some purpose. The anthropologist John Marks said that, quote, "Evolution is much more like a tree than an escalator. Darwin thought of evolution as producing separate branches, like those of a tree, with the tips representing different living species. But the word evolution implies to many people an unfolding, a development along a path." This is what the word originally meant to Darwin, who avoided it for this reason in the first edition of The Origin of the Species. Darwin knew that this conception of evolution as an escalator was really dangerous, and it could be used as a political weapon by misconstruing some products of evolution as inherently better than others. That's why he initially didn't use the term evolution. Indeed, history is littered with examples of people misconstruing evolutionary theory to place themselves on a top of an evolutionary hierarchy. Evolution in any domain is simply a process that creates designs or adaptations depending on what is selected. If evolution had a motto, it might be whatever works. In the world of humans and culture, the most important question we can ask ourselves is works for who and to what end? In nature, evolution doesn't go anywhere per se. It's an unintentional trial and error process, and the bottom line is whatever works for survival and reproduction. The selection ingredient is really the linchpin. It determines what kinds of designs show up. Morality doesn't really enter the picture in biological evolution. It produces some pretty cool, but also some pretty dark adaptations. Female black widow spiders, for instance, are known to devour their mates, which I'm pretty glad my wife hasn't done yet. Evolution all by itself doesn't make everything nice. Crucially, cultural evolution, just like natural evolution, will go to some pretty dark places. It will take us places we don't necessarily want to go. If your top priority is profit, if you are selecting for whatever works to maximize profit, evolution will give you fantastic traits and adaptations for maximizing profit. That sounds a lot like our modern form of capitalism to me. If what you value and what you prize most is getting the most shares and attention, evolution will give you glorious, complex traits and adaptations for grabbing and hooking people's attention by whatever means necessary. That sounds like social media and cable TV. If your top priority is maintaining comfort and the status quo, and you have a bunch of white guys that look like me in charge, you'll evolve systems that prioritize the comfort and power of white men. That sounds like the patriarchy and systemic racism. And here's the important part. It doesn't take a bunch of evil geniuses sitting around a boardroom to produce these outcomes. What evolution teaches us is that even without intentional design, even if it were a dumb trial and error process, if we were selecting for profit or comfort or maximum attention, evolution would still give us these outcomes. But fortunately, all this works the other way as well. We don't need a perfect grand plan to make the world a better place. We don't need the perfect plan or strategy or forecast. We don't need to be that clever. We just need to harness the three ingredients and especially be mindful of what we are selecting. When it comes to evolutionary processes happening in our messy human world, the values we prioritize are everything. January's theme for Soul Matters is living with intention. From an evolutionary lens, intention, our values, what we prioritize, they shape the direction evolution will go. If values like love and connection are our bottom line, we can start to evolve a more loving, connected world. However, intention is only half the story. It's not quite good enough on its own. Notice how I said one of the ingredients in evolution was selection by consequences. In order for intention to change the world, our intentions have to have consequences. Intention has to be consecrated with action. After action, we need to ask ourselves, what worked and what didn't? Did that action have the consequences that supported my values? Reflection completes the cycle. Intention, action, then listening and reflection. If you're like me, you're conditioned to think about personal change in terms of goals or in terms of product. Product over process. This time of year, some of us set a bunch of New Year's resolutions and new goals. And if you're like me, some of those resolutions and goals have already gone out the window. But what if we thought about personal change differently? What if instead of a smart goal, we had a smart process? We could put our evolutionary algorithm into action. You could pick a value you wanted to bring in the world. You could try a bunch of different things, notice what works, keep the best and reinforce it, and keep moving forward. Intend, act, reflect. If you could focus on process and small changes the way evolutionary thinking suggests we should, would you be a little more open and responsive to other beings and your environment? Could you let your environment shape you a little bit so things fit a little better? Could you treat failure a little more like feedback? Could you give yourself a little bit more time and patience? On a collective level, so that was the individual level, but on the collective level of groups, selection is all about shared purpose. A shared purpose keeps a group together, tells it what to reinforce and what to carry on into the future. And that's kind of what we're doing in this listening project. I'm lucky enough to be one of the facilitators for the listening project. And the process is one that we can clarify our goals in a group, or we can clarify our values rather in a small group by really thinking about what works, what has been an experience in UUFCO that's really touched you. And then the process is envisioning how do we take that into the future as a group. So really our listening process is part of an evolutionary process of this congregation going into the future. And religious traditions have developed all sorts of ways to help groups prioritize and remember their shared purpose. At UUFCO, we have the Children's Covenant, our Fellowship's Covenant, the weekly sermon, and of course, song. And they all point us towards certain values and intentions. These include love, connection, and justice. It tells us not exactly what to do, but how to be with one another. It tells us what kinds of things to try and what kinds of things we want to reinforce. So with that in mind, let's listen now to our choir sing, "Be the Change."
Be the change we want to see in the world. Be the change you want to see in the world. Be the change you want to see in the world. And change will come to you. Be the change you want to see in the world. Be the change see in the world. Be the change you want to see
if you have a chalice at home, I invite you to extinguish it now as we say the covenant of our fellowship. Love is the spirit of our fellowship, and service is its law. This is our fellowship. Peace, seek the truth in love, and to help one another. I promise I had that memorized for 9. I don't know. So for you science nerds out there, you're in luck. Right now is an exciting time to be a science nerd. There is a whole army of scientists, economists, and psychologists rediscovering Darwin's ideas and putting it to work on big questions and hard problems. I hope this talk has helped you view things from a slightly different lens, but I only really scratched the surface of what evolution can do. It can shed light on things like how to cooperate more effectively, the problem of good and evil, new kinds of therapy, why there are Democrats and Republicans, yes, even that, social contagion, the list just goes on. One of the leaders in this area is an evolutionary biologist named David Sloan Wilson, and his work has really changed how I see the world. And if you want to learn more about this perspective, I would check out evolutioninstitute.org or his book, Evolution for Everyone. So even though we are now in a renaissance of Darwinian thought, the list of scientists and philosophers and theologians who were influenced by Darwin is long and goes back many, many years. One of my favorites is Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, who was a French scientist, philosopher, and Jesuit priest. Teilhard worked in the earliest 20th century, and he had his own theory of evolution and how humans are evolving. In his book, Toward the Future, he says, quote, the day will come when after harnessing the ether, the winds and the tides and gravitation, we shall harness for God the energies of love. And on that day, for the second time in the history of the world, man will have discovered fire. As we collectively and individually head into 2022, may we find the truth in love and use its light to evolve a future that is a little more kind, a little more open, and a little more loving. May it be so.